So what is GDP? The GDP is perhaps the most common way of describing the size of an economy. It's a collection of all the economic activity that occurred for that year, and whenever you hear someone say the economy grew 2% or 3%, what they're describing is the size of the GDP and how much that grew within that period of time. Common ways of describing the size of the GDP are either using American dollars or purchasing power parity. The downsides with using American dollars, usually called the nominal GDP, is that different countries have different levels of wages and different countries will manipulate their currency in different ways. Usually that's to make their exports more competitive. As an example, if one economy produced one house at $200,000 and another economy produced four houses at $50,000, the nominal GDP would suggest that those two economies are exactly the same size when clearly one is outproducing the other one. To get around this, we use purchasing power parity, which adjusts those numbers relative to a basket of goods within those countries. Previous example, the second economy would have its GDP multiplied by 4 to adjust for the fact that houses in that economy were 1/4 the price of the houses in the other economy. At this small scale, that works great, and if you were theoretically able to do this for the entire economy, it would actually be a great way of analysing the economy. The problem is it never actually works out this way, and instead what we get is the entire economy being multiplied by a multiplier that's related to a basket of goods. And what this tends to do is benefit unequal economies over economies with greater income equality. So hypothetically, if we had two economies which were exactly the same size in terms of US dollars and which had exactly the same population, the economy which had greater income inequality would actually look larger than the other economy because of that basket of goods. Lower wages at the poorer section of the economy result in cheaper Big Macs and cheaper haircuts, reducing the price of that basket of goods and increasing the multiplier effect on purchasing power parity. Hypothetically, if you had an economy where 20% of the population were slaves, this would drastically reduce the price of these things and massively increase that multiplier effect, making that slave economy appear much larger than, let's say, an economy with high income equality. And this actually creates a perverse incentive for the politicians of a country, where if they work to reduce the wages of the average person, it will actually make the economy seem larger than it otherwise would. Now I'm going to discuss the maths behind this. If you find this part boring, you can just skip the rest of the video. While this does make sense logically, I couldn't find any studies that discuss this topic at all. I found quite a few studies that discuss whether or not income inequality was related to GDP per person. But considering how important the GDP numbers are, I'm surprised that there were absolutely no studies discussing whether or not they were skewed one way or the other. So using the numbers for 2020, I ran a correlation test between the purchasing power parity multiplier. In this case, a lower number means a higher multiplier. And I ran that test with income inequality and I found a strong correlation between the two. Now normally that would be the end of it. But I can imagine a few of you are saying, well, if GDP per capita is also associated with income inequality, as you can see here, is the reason that that multiplier is so correlated to income inequality mainly because of the fact that the GDP per capita is correlated to the income inequality? So I ran a test for correlation between the income inequality and that multiplier, adjusting for GDP per capita. And what I found was almost no correlation between the two. In fact, the correlation was in the opposite direction that it was before. So this part confused me. Why would the correlation switch from one way to the other way? And I thought, perhaps this effect was happening differently in poor countries and rich countries. So I split the two groups up into countries with a GDP higher than 10,000 and countries with a GDP less than 10,000. And I did the same test again. And what I found was that countries with a GDP of less than 10,000 per capita, this effect was going in the opposite direction of countries with a GDP of above 10,000 per capita. Meaning that for countries with a GDP higher than 10,000 US dollars per capita, the purchasing power parity multiplier was higher for countries with higher income inequality. And for countries with less than 10,000 US dollars per capita GDP, the multiplier was lower for countries with higher income inequality. So in conclusion, what does this all mean? Countries where the GDP per capita is higher than 10,000 US dollars, their economies will seem larger because of this multiplier if they're more unequal. Countries where the GDP per capita is less than 10,000, this multiplier will make their economy seem smaller if they're more unequal. I'm honestly not sure why that is for the poorer countries. It might have something to do with corruption making the price of goods a lot more expensive than they otherwise would be, but this is totally a guess and it could be one of a million things.